Over the last few decades, Japanese media has slowly become more and more popular in the West. Whether it's Japanese video games, anime, or anything in between, it's hard to deny that the West has slowly become more and more accepting of works from other cultures. And rightfully so. Cultural and societal differences can go a long way to creating fresh and unique takes on various ideas and stories. So being able to share those around the world is great for the innovation of media as a whole. Over the past few years, however, there's been more and more discussion on how these works are adapted into the English language. A lot of people feel the way these works are being brought over is butchering the source material, or that they're inserting Western ideologies where they don't belong. As someone who consumes a lot of Japanese media, this discussion has caught my eye more than a few times. And now more than ever, it seems there's a lot of confusion about what constitutes as meddling in someone else's work versus faithfully adapting it for another culture. So out of personal curiosity, I decided to do some research on the topic, and I found the results to be pretty interesting. I want to start with the stigma surrounding the act of localization. I often see the term thrown around interchangeably with translation, and while they are similar, in reality the two processes are very different from each other. Translation is defined as the process of converting written or spoken text from one language to another, while localization is the process of adapting a product or content into a specific language and cultural context. That last bit is really important. While the two processes share similarities, both have different intentions when actively translating the work, which ends up influencing the final product. In simple terms, translation is converting a sentence or work as directly as possible to another language, while localization is taking the work and its surrounding cultural and narrative context and adapting it in such a way that it's easily understood in the target language's cultural context. While sometimes these two objectives can overlap, because of the different cultural circumstances baked into the spoken and written language of any culture, the latter often takes more time and consideration. Basically, you can look at all localization as a form of translation, but not all translations are localizations. This distinction is important because it influences the outcome of whatever piece of media you're trying to adapt. Most localizations need to change a few things here and there to keep the same effect the work has in its source language. There's a lot of different things that can introduce a need to slightly alter a line or plot beat when adapting it into another language, ranging anywhere from clashing cultural norms to even the target audience the adaptation is aimed toward. Modern-day localizations are much closer to translations than they've ever been. But to give you a better idea of the innate differences between a translation and a localization, let's take a quick look at arguably the most infamous localizations that I'm sure at least most of you are familiar with.
Yo!
Nowadays, 4Kids Entertainment is notorious for their English versions of popular anime of the time. I hesitate to even call these dubs, because in reality they do a lot more than just translating the dialogue into English. But because they're such extreme examples, I think they do a really good job of portraying the innate differences between a translation and a localization. One of the most important distinctions between the two practices is target audience. In most anime dubs, the target audience is whatever language the show is being translated to. But in 4Kids' case, there was an extra factor that heavily impacted the end result. See, 4Kids wasn't simply translating these shows into English. They were doing so for American children during primetime television slots. The TV guidelines between Japan and the United States are already pretty different, but coupled with even stricter guidelines on programs that air during primetime slots, and 4Kids choosing to license shows like One Piece that typically target an audience slightly older than the one they're trying to appeal to, a lot of censorship and even some plot changes had to be done to adhere to these local guidelines. While some shows had it worse than others, all of them were subject to changes that fundamentally alter the source material. But you know what the weird thing is? It worked. Despite countless examples of drastic changes to both characters and plots, shows like Yu-Gi-Oh!, One Piece, and the Pokemon anime all went on to become massive mainstream successes. Now, just because these localizations were successful doesn't mean they're particularly good. Despite my personal fondness for the English versions of shows like Yu-Gi-Oh! And Pokemon, it's hard to deny that these versions of the show are often worse off for the changes they made, and more often than not get in the way of the author's intention.
This'll save my plan.
Knife's in this pouch!
Remember, it's your rubber knife.
Better be!
What these shows do excel at, however, is exemplifying the differences between a goal of a localization and a translation. The main goal of a localization is to make as many aspects of the work immediately understandable to the new target audience as possible. In 4Kids' case, that meant dumbing down and censoring some of its shows to better appeal to their younger demographic. As I mentioned before though, 4Kids is an extreme case, and thankfully nowadays there's a much greater effort to keep as much of the original authorial intent as possible when localizing a work. Now that these pieces of media are targeting more of a mainstream audience than ever before, you have to make sure as much of the plot and subtext is immediately understandable when adapting it into another language. We're long past the days of fan subbing. Your average 9-to-5 worker isn't going to want to pause a show every 5 minutes to read a paragraph of translator's notes just to understand a one-off joke. As a result, sometimes more culturally specific aspects of a narrative need to be adjusted slightly. To what extent these changes should occur varies from work to work. Some adaptations decide to keep more culturally specific aspects if they add to immersion or the work's themes. It would be weird if a game like Persona 5, for example, Americanized its characters and setting, since its plot and themes are heavily rooted in Japanese culture and society. But in most localizations, when changes are made, they're done usually to convey a similar if not identical idea to the one that's present in the original work, but one that might be more culturally relevant in the target language. A good example of this can be seen in the English dub of My Hero Academia. The series follows Izuku Midoriya, a young boy who's bullied for being one of the rare few born without a superpower in a predominantly superhuman society. The people around him, more specifically his childhood bully Bakugo, give him the nickname Deku as a way to insult and belittle him. After receiving a power of his own from his mentor and enrolling in a superhero academy, one of Izuku's new classmates overhears Bakugo calling him Deku during training, and assumes that's his name. Later, when she calls him that for the first time, he quickly corrects her and tells her that it's intended to be an insult. After apologizing, she then proceeds to flip the meaning of the name on its head in both versions of the show, but the way she does it in each version is slightly different. In the original Japanese version, she says she likes the name because it sounds like the Japanese phrase for "you can do it," while in English she says she likes it because it sounds like a cool hero name and because it sounds cute. While the reasoning behind liking the name is slightly different, the end result is still the same. The recontextualization leads to Izuku seeing the name in a new light, and starts working to reclaim the name Deku by using it as his hero name, becoming more confident in himself in the process. While they probably could have left the reasoning behind Uraraka's appreciation of the name in the English version, you run the risk of taking the English-speaking audience out of what's supposed to be an important moment, even if it's just for a minute, since you'd likely have to stop and explain the meaning for it to make sense to that audience. This new version still works because it's still culturally relevant to the English-speaking audience, while also making sense for Deku as a character. Of course, a socially awkward nerd like Deku would latch onto a girl inadvertently calling him cute, and turn it into a source of motivation. And since this sparks their friendship, it remains a constant motivator for the rest of the series. So in short, the localized version succeeds because it maintains the intent of the original script, while adapting it in a way that's instantly relatable to its target audience, rather than directly adapting the original meaning rooted in Japanese wordplay and risking confusing them. Another example of a good localization change is in The World Ends With You. The World Ends With You follows our main character Neku, a social outcast who's unexpectedly dragged into a surreal death game. This game is heavily steeped in late 2000s Japanese internet culture, and as such its character dynamics needed to be adjusted when translating the game into English. The most obvious character change is with Neku. Over the course of the game, we slowly see Neku come out of his shell and open up to the people around him. His arc involves him learning to accept people the way they are, and how meeting and talking with them can expand his worldview. Neku is initially portrayed as this extremely rude outcast, but the way this is tackled differs in both versions due to different cultural standards. In the original Japanese version, for example, Neku's character is extremely blunt and talks to people without using honorifics, which in grossly simple terms is the same as using a title like Mr. or Mrs. in English. While these traits might not seem super out of the ordinary in an American context, in Japan, talking to people you don't know in such an informal way is considered exceptionally rude. So to keep this aspect of Neku's character intact, they made him more explicitly hostile in the English script. He insults pretty much everyone around him, curses a lot, and is all around a huge asshole. While the two interpretations of the character are inherently different in their tone and attitude, the effect on the narrative and his character arc ends up the same across both languages, and so the localization succeeds in being an accurate adaptation of the work. You can actually see how this change affects the narrative firsthand if you watch the anime adaptation of the game. The English script in this version is much closer to a direct translation than the game script, and as a result, Neku is noticeably more mellow. This was actually a big contention among English-speaking fans when the anime came out. because over here it lessens the impact of the narrative's themes when watching in English compared to the game's localization. A similar thing happens with the game's other characters, specifically companion characters Shiki and Beat. Like Neku, they also drop the honorifics standard in Japanese speech, but the different context behind the two completely changes their characterization. Shiki drops them in an attempt to appear more friendly to everyone she meets, which is reflective of her need to be accepted by everyone around her. This character trait doesn't get adapted as well in the localization, but they do make an effort to make her dialogue more overly cheery and friendly, so with the context of her past that's brought up in the story, I think the effect is similar. Beat, on the other hand, is almost the exact opposite. His reason for not using the honorifics is to make him come off as rude and brash, to exemplify his bad boy persona. They adapted this as him using slang primarily associated with delinquents, which works to support his tough guy personality. Like the changes made to Neku's character, these changes still work because they preserve the intentions of the original characters. They've just been adapted to work within the norms of American culture. I chose these two examples because I think they do a good job of highlighting the spectrum of what's typically considered during the localization process. The cultural differences between different languages requires a lot of consideration when bringing over a particular piece of media. Japanese is already an extremely complex language. What appears to be a simple line can have a completely different meaning depending on a variety of factors. Anything from tone, the presence or lack of honorifics, the specific words, to even how those words are spelled can completely change the meaning of a sentence. It's because of those reasons that adapting a piece of media into another language is way more than just a direct translation. If you want it to make as much sense as possible and instantly connect with your audience, you have to not only consider all the things mentioned previously, but also any character dynamics, personalities, plot beats, etc. that the work might rely on. It's because of this that I think it's really frustrating when someone who doesn't understand the language tries to dog on a given localization. Now don't get me wrong, I sympathize with the intention behind some of these people. When bringing a work over, it makes sense to want as much of it to stay the same as possible for the sake of artistic integrity. However, as we've established, the innate cultural differences that exist between Japanese and English society necessitate changes to keep the intentions of the author intact, while also making it as comprehensible as possible to the most amount of people. It feels like a lot of times that people focus on the mere fact that there are changes, rather than the effect the changes actually have on the work. It doesn't help that a lot of these people tend to use machine translation to back up their arguments. While machine translation can give you a pretty good idea of what the original text is saying, it's just that, an idea. In the process of directly translating in this way, you lose most if not all of the nuance that the original text might have. It's also important to note that a part of the localizer's job is keeping a character's personality intact as well, which in a lot of cases is lost when you use a direct machine translation. Maybe this is a hot take, but I just can't take these people seriously most of the time. I don't understand how someone can look at the most bland, dry, boring translation of a line possible and say, "Wow, this is so much better than what we got. Thanks, localizers!" I'm 99% sure a lot of the people complaining about changes in these localizations haven't even tried to play the games in question. Like dog, these people have been complaining about games that weren't even out yet. I don't know how you can look at a sentence like this and think that the meaning of the sentence is completely changed. It's very obviously the same sentence, just reworded to sound like an actual person would say it. Maybe if they at least tried to interact with the media a little bit, they'd see that these changes work in the context of the game, instead of posting the same 3 problematic scenes over and over again to farm engagement. My point with this video wasn't to white knight for all localizations. Not every localization is created equal. Just like there can be bad parts of good games, some great localizations can miss the mark in different aspects here and there. One that immediately comes to mind is the localization for Breath of the Wild. In the original script, the objective descriptions for the main and side quests are written in first person, acting as sort of a diary entry for Link. But in the localized version, they're sterilized to be more standard objective descriptions, which is kinda lame. There's always room to give constructed criticism on a localization that genuinely hurts the intention of the original work. But from what I've seen online, it's often not used for that purpose. Instead, the cause is often used to attack localizers who are just trying to do their job. Surely it's just a coincidence that the people mainly bringing up these talking points over and over again are subscribed to the service that gives you money for interactions. I think it's really funny how these people will champion artistic integrity and accuracy to justify their actions, only to then flip their shit when a game like the Thousand Year Door remake uncensors its translation and adds something they deem as woke. There's been a push to replace human localizers with machine translation, which I think is a horrible idea. While direct translation can be comprehensible at times, because of the innate differences between Japanese and English speech, they often come out overly verbose or with an awkward sentence structure, so having an actual human present to make sure it sounds right in the target language is essential for comprehension. Hell, there's already some cases in games where mistranslated lines create tons of confusion, both for game mechanics and plot details. Can you imagine if this started happening on a larger scale if we took out the human aspect of the process? Every game would sound like an early 90s NES game. It would be horrible. These works are inherently human expressions, and so I think the way we do it now is the best way to ensure that expression is properly adapted into another language. Another human capable of taking into account context and narrative implications will do a far better job than feeding everything into a robot. Like most controversies on the internet, the biggest thing this conversation lacks right now is nuance. While even the best localizations have their drawbacks, on the whole I think the work these localizers do goes a long way to making these works more accessible to a wider audience. And I think by attacking the whole profession because of the acts of a few, we're diminishing the efforts of the ones that go above and beyond to make sure the works are as accurate as possible for their target language. Whether this lack of nuance is intentional by those bringing it forward or not, I can't say. But instead of denouncing a localization for the mere act of changing something, we should instead talk about if/how these changes affect the overall work. Hopefully then we can have a more educated discussion on how these works are adapted, and in the process advocate for stronger products in the future.